Welcome everybody to this live recording of our Afikra Conversations podcast. Our special guest is Professor Christina Riggs. Christina is a historian of photography and archaeology with a particular interest in North Africa and the Middle East. Her research has considered how different people at different times have imagined, studied, and represented the culture we know as ancient Egypt, capital E, and how the fields of archaeology, art history, and Egyptology developed in tandem with colonial and imperial expansion. Most recently, she's been working on the history of Tutankhamun, discovery and the different trajectories taken by the tomb, its treasures, and its archive from the 1920s to the present day. This is the subject of her most recent book, Treasured: How Tutankhamun Shaped a Century, which came out in 2021. Her study of the photographic archive of that excavation, including the work of Harry Burton, had been published in a book called Photographing Tutankhamun, which came out in 2019, as well as several articles, catalogs, and essays, and as a museum exhibition. Christina, welcome to Afikra.
Thank you so much, Mikey. It's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation. It's been wonderful to discover the work you're doing.
Thanks so much. So I guess the first place to start is, was it Indiana Jones? What exactly made you want to become an Egyptologist? How did you get roped into this this field?
Yeah, it wasn't Indiana Jones, although I did have a huge crush on Harrison Ford, thanks to the Star Wars movies and then Indiana Jones. But I actually talk in the new book, Treasured. I sort of literally open the book, talking about how I got interested in it as a little girl in what Americans call sixth grade. So I was about 10 years old. I'd skipped a grade. I was a very bright, but very awkward little girl. And I just remember sitting in this room in my little kind of Ohio hometown, watching the teacher, Mrs. Williams, go through ancient Egypt, and which we spent weeks on, actually. She loved it. And we've since been in touch, and she told me that ancient Egypt offered her, as a new teacher, an opportunity to cover social studies, history, art, mathematics. We did ancient Egyptian math. And I just fell in love with it. And I fell in love with it visually. And it gave me something different, I guess. It gave me something to focus on when I needed a focus. And it was something unusual also. And so I was no longer like unusual for just being this shy, awkward kind of little girl, but I was unusual because I knew everything about ancient Egypt. And I took it from there.
Well, what was the I'm sure there were long stretches where you weren't, I mean, from fourth grade or sixth grade or whatever year.
10 years old, yeah.
Yeah, from 10 years old to 21, were there lapses, or were you just obsessed with ancient Egypt the entire time?
I wouldn't say obsessed, but I was really into it. And I was really into history and art in general. Yeah. And so I decided by the time I was, 12, 13, I decided I was going to be an Egyptologist. Once I learned that word, that was what I was going to do. And I chose my university strictly on that. I would not consider any other university except ones where I could study that. Wow. So it really drove me forward. In a way that maybe in retrospect wasn't healthy, but at the time it did the job. Yeah. Somehow getting me to where I wanted to be.
So let's talk, we were talking briefly beforehand about the term Egyptologist, right? So in my mind's eye, when I think of an Egyptologist, I largely think of a, Gertrude Bell, a Indiana Jones, Sean Connery type character, who's either American or British, or German, and is sort of like in some khaki panted outfit in Egypt. What's wrong with that image, I guess?
Well, okay, where to start? First of all, I don't identify myself as an Egyptologist anymore. Yeah. I very consciously reject that term. It does not, to me, feel like a comfortable term in 2021. Why do we have an ology stuck on to the name of a country? And yet it at the same time manages to imagine an eternal, geographically defined nation and culture, Egypt, and yet concerns itself only with the history of Egypt before for instance, the kind of Greek and Roman governance of the country, and definitely before the arrival of Islam. So to me, that's a very strange thing for us to be doing, to be carrying on this term that it emerges, it appears in French and English dictionaries in the mid-19th century, so in the 1850s. It's a new word. So to still identify as that, to me, is not comfortable and doesn't reflect what I do and how I think. In terms of the image of a British or American, and you might equally say French, Dutch, Italian, German, scholar, always coming from the Western Europe, Western and Northern Europe, and the Eurocentric, or the West, I'm doing scare quotes, the West, as it imagined itself in opposition to the territories of the so-called Middle East and of Africa and South America, where it could go and discover things. So there's archaeology, and our understanding of the ancient past is inevitably filtered through, or rather formed through, those power dynamics.
Yeah. So let's talk about these two books that we have on screen for those listening to the podcast and who can't see the screen. There's two books. The first is The Beautiful Burial in Roman Egypt, and the second is Unwrapping Ancient Egypt. And you had actually given me a clue as to why these two books are interestingly juxtaposed, both biographically for you, but also like thematically. So give us a sense of why that's true.
So we're looking at, I suppose they're my first and second books that I ever published. And the first one, The Beautiful Burial in Roman Egypt, is the one I'm still known for in the discipline, in the academic discipline of Egyptology. A student just emailed me the other week saying, oh, what an amazing book. I mean, it came out in like 2005. Oh, what's a fantastic book. I'm using it. Could you tell me more about this? And I'm sort of like, well, that's my old work. I don't think about it. I wouldn't do the book that way. If I had it to do over it again. It grew out of my doctoral thesis, so the work I did to get my PhD at Oxford University. So I lived with that work for many, many years, and it was a culmination of that phase of, that really did start in the 6th grade in Ohio, of I'm going to be an Egyptologist. And yeah, I had sort of found my way into it by combining. I can see now in retrospect that I wasn't satisfied at the time, even as I was studying to become an Egyptologist, with that limitation of, you've got to read hieroglyphs and you only study these historical periods. I really wanted to work with visual material, and I really wanted to understand what we were never being taught in class, which was sort of cultural translation, as it were, cultural contact, the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, as this incredible, maybe melting pot is a trite word, but of people moving around, of different languages and cultures and traditions and practices, inevitably moving around that space. And so my specific focus was on Egypt during the Roman Empire, and how very different cultural strands kind of came together. So I'm proud of that book, and it was great. By the time that book came out, I was working as a museum curator, which was work that I loved, because I really loved the direct contact with ancient material. That is really stunning, kind of to have the contact with some things that people have made thousands of years ago, and to understand the materiality of those things. But at the same time that I was doing that, because I also really liked sort of talking to the public and that public engagement, working with kids, that sort of thing. But at the same time, being responsible for a museum collection in an industrial town in England, Manchester, in the north of England, which was the center of England's cotton industry, cotton textile industry in Victorian Britain, cotton, Egypt, yeah. Suddenly I came face to face with, the fact that this, what I thought of as past colonialism, British Empire, whatever, it's done, it's finished, it's just the stuff wound up here. No, there's so much more to it. That has completely, that's why I changed from filtered, to shaped what we know. And particularly that as manifested in Manchester, thanks to various histories of that institution and individuals who had worked there, that specifically took the place of the fate of the linen textiles, because in ancient Egypt, people wove linen. What's now we think of Egypt and cotton, but the ancient textile used was almost exclusively linen, flax. So the fate that the ancient textiles had in the museum collection, and the fate of the bodies, the human bodies and human remains in that collection, was a really a crisis, a professional, personal crisis. I left that job to not quite knowing what I was going to go on to. Eventually, I found my way back into the academy as an academic, but that experience informed the research and the writing of the other book you've mentioned that you've put on the screen for those who are watching, which is called Unwrapping Ancient Egypt, which weaves together, that's a good metaphor, weaves together the history of the unwrapping of mummified bodies, embalmed human beings and animals, that was the foundation from the very early 19th century onwards. That was the foundation of Western Egyptology, before it even called itself Egyptology, was the destruction of these bodies, which were in fact sacred objects, which were the product of ritual, of a cultural kind of focus on the sacred, on what to do with certain human bodies and certain animal bodies. So Egyptology is born out of destroying what it claims to want to study and to love. And I don't think that the field has yet resolved that tension. So this was my sort of shift. I also was writing the book, had done the research, had a period of research leave, a year of sabbatical to write the book, when Tahrir Square happened, when the Egyptian Revolution of 2011 happened. So I sort of, tore up what I'd started writing and started over, because I felt that manifested, in fact, the perpetuation in Western discourse of Egypt, modern Egypt, as a place that is totally separated from ancient Egypt. And ancient Egypt is what the West controls, understands, appreciates, and takes care of. And I saw comments that Egyptologists were making in the press, and the kind of world reaction. Nobody cared about people. They cared about antiquities, and that bothered me and still does.
So it's a pretty, in this case, a self-critical exercise, but it's also a critique of your colleagues and a discipline that you grew to love and engaged in. What was the response of the academy more broadly to a text like this?
Oh, that's such a good question, Mikey. I don't know. I think the book to this day is better known outside of Egyptology, but I find that hard to judge, because I still, some of my best friends literally are Egyptologists, both, in Egypt, because of course they're Egyptian Egyptologists, and I would love to hear more about their take on these kinds of issues and vocabularies and experiences. Anyway, I was saying that I think the reception probably had a bit more attention from really a range of people, because it touches on museum studies, it touches on textiles, anthropology, our histories of archaeology. So it's, I'm sometimes amazed at the people who kind of find it and it resonates for them. Whereas in Egyptology, I get sort of colleagues who say, either who don't mention it, it doesn't get cited, maybe they're not aware of it. Maybe I should have come up with a catchier subtitle or something, I don't know. Or who sort of will say, oh yeah, it's great, oh, it's so challenging, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know yet, I don't have a sense yet of whether the ideas have an active effect, are sort of filtering through or having an effect on what Egyptologists who identify as such and who work, for instance, in museums, what they do with it.
Yeah. Okay. I want to, let me go ahead. Do you have can I ask you a question? Okay. So before we move on to Treasured and some of the other books, I want to ask you a question too. If you were to, on the fly, rewrite that 6th grade curriculum, how should 10-year-olds in Ohio and places like Ohio be learning about ancient Egypt? And should they be learning about ancient Egypt?
I think it's that second question I keep coming back to, because again, as I discovered and researching and writing Treasured, thinking about what got me started and realizing that Egypt turns up on the national curriculum in America, or not national, sorry, states choose their own curricula, but it turns up on school curricula in America, partly as an American government, a US government push in the 1970s, late 1970s, to get that Americans should feel friendly towards Egypt. This is for political reasons in the wake of the 1973 to 74 oil crisis, reaching out to Sadat, what leads to the Camp David Accords. You know, so it's a political decision always.
Wait, really? So in the 60s?
In the 70s.
Yeah, no, but hold on. Yeah. Are you telling me that in the 60s, sixth graders in the 60s did not study about the pyramids and ancient Egypt?
Yeah, it was really difficult to find any research. I think maybe I wasn't looking in the same or information data, like about exactly what was being taught where. But there was definitely a push, like for instance, to provide film strips and kind of media by the part of a sort of government Department of Education. So that, and it wasn't all about ancient Egypt, but a lot of it was.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a push. Tutankhamun has a revival starting in the 1960s, but really takes off in the 1970s as the exhibitions of objects that Egypt lends to different museums and countries in America, Canada, and Japan and Western Europe. That's the real push. What I don't, so in Britain, for instance, there was a national curriculum, a national level curriculum was only put in place, as I understand it, in the much more recently. And ancient Egypt features on there as well, but it's really what I've seen from friends who have kids, you know, and their kids bring home these really banal kind of worksheets about mummies. I mean, why should kids be learning? It's kind of disgusting, actually, and disrespectful. It's dehumanizing. Why, you know, this idea about the goriness? Okay, so maybe like kids, Egypt's interesting because, you know, there's color, there's unusual things, and it is impressive, and it is an ancient and important culture, but so are lots of other ancient cultures that they could and should be learning about. That's one thing. And the other point would be, you know, all the things that kids can learn. It's also, to me, it seems about learning about the modern world as well, and those relations.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, let's talk about sort of the byline of this book. So Treasured came out in 2021, and the byline is How Tutankhamun Shaped a Century. If you'll humor me by asking this question, how did Tutankhamun shape a century?
A hammer and a chisel. No, it's a metaphor for how the famous kind of much talked about, we'll hear about it all year, I'm afraid, discovery of the tomb in November 1922, becomes such a global media event and inspires so much media coverage, but also takes place that it kind of seems to open up like a new modern era. It also takes place against certain political events, and that I wanted to trace that theme through the 1920s. I've always said Tutankhamun had much more influence in the 20th century than he did in his own lifetime, right? So how do these objects, how does the kind of control, the discovery of these objects, their existence in the world, I suppose, the existence of this tomb and the find, and this famous set of photographs in particular, how does that flow in and out of a world history, and then particularly relations between Egypt and the former colonial and imperial powers, later on the United States and the Soviet Union as well? How does that shape or create, let's say, certain possibilities in terms of cultural diplomacy, commerce and late capitalism, the development of museum exhibitions, and ways of thinking about Egypt that are now reduced to, let's say, I don't know, Marvel TV series and worksheets for little kids about how to make a mummy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know if that answers it. It's a subtitle that's meant to kind of intrigue people into thinking, wait a minute, he's really dead. What did he actually do?
So it seems like the 1960s was this turning point for an increase in sort of popularity. What happened between the 20s and the 60s? Why was there a sort of a pivot point in the 60s?
So what had the 20s, big splash, huge phenomenon, and then inevitably interest kind of peters out. Second World War, there's Tutankhamun, there's the displays in the museum in the 1930s. It's not that he's like unimportant, and definitely like Egypt, like throughout the 20s and 30s, politicians and visiting politicians pay visits to the tomb, or they pay visits to the, I've got a gorgeous photo in the book of the young, the Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran, coming to visit the Mask of Tutankhamun. So there's that is still going on, but the world's got other things on its mind. In the 1940s, what happens post with the post 1952 Egyptian revolution, and then with Nasser eventually coming into power, and his decision to go ahead with plans that were already in place, they've been around since the late 40s, to build the high dam at Aswan. There's a realization moving into the 1950s that doing that dam, not only obviously, Egypt's having to negotiate with former powers, with the new Soviet Union, with the rise of America, in terms of funding and logistics and the engineering know-how. The Soviet Union plays a big part in that, but also there's a realization on the part of the first of the Egyptian Antiquities authorities that a number of archaeological sites and temples are going to be flooded by the reservoir, what we now know, what Egyptians know as Lake Nasser. And so there's an idea, it may actually come, I talk about this in Treasured, it seems to come maybe from an American museum director who says, well, why don't you lend us, send some objects from the tomb of Tutankhamun on tour to America to raise awareness, as a goodwill gesture to America, to raise awareness of this fantastic Egyptian project, this modernization, the dam, all the things that power, that electric power promises for Egypt. And also, to raise awareness of it becomes a UNESCO campaign to save those monuments, those temples and threatened sites that are going to be flooded. And so 1961, it's the first Minister of Culture of Egypt, Dr. Sarwat Okasha, sorry, excuse my pronunciation of Arabic names, who gives the go-ahead. He's part of Nasser's inner circle, and so there's this tour to 1961, about 32 objects from the tomb of Tutankhamun, nice little kind of easy to transport objects, are greeted by Jackie Kennedy. And it goes on from there. And everyone's surprised, pleasantly surprised, that people do remember Tutankhamun. So people who were kids in the 20s, right, are able then in the 60s, before international tourism was a thing, only a few elites could afford to travel or had the infrastructure to travel. So to be able to see something like that in your own hometown or in the next big city, and it zigzagged across the United States, places like Omaha, Toledo, St. Louis, Chicago, for 3 years, and then wound up at the 1964 New York World's Fair and went on from there. So huge new interest.
So in 64, it becomes sort of a global phenomenon.
Yeah, 63, 64, there's a French curator, Christian de Roche-Noblecourt, who wrote a book about Tutankhamun, and the publisher, British publisher, arranged beautiful new color photographs of the objects. So the ability to print those in color in this, really nicely packaged book. It was translated into a couple of dozen languages. Someone on Twitter, a couple of weeks ago got in touch with me from, Finland, I think. Yeah, that her father was the translator into Finnish.
You're kidding me.
That is the huge success, that book. So exactly, it becomes a real linchpin of the UNESCO kind of campaign to save the monuments of Nubia, and of a second kind of a rebirth of the Tutankhamun as cultural phenomenon.
So I want to talk about this book briefly and about sort of you being a photographic historian. I think that's how it's written in your bio. But tell me a little bit about some of the photographers that are capturing these moments. Who are these humans who are carrying these cameras, and what role do you think that they're actually playing?
Right, good question. Can we go back? Because you had a couple of nice slides with the photos, and then I can try to describe them for the podcast, the black and white.
So like, I think this is Harry Burton, right?
He's taken the photograph. He's not in the photograph.
Yeah.
And is there another one that shows the, that one? No, that one. That's the one that, so this is a photograph taken, oh gosh, I can't remember. It's like 1925. So that's a big fallacy with the tomb of Tutankhamun. People think it all happened like in 1922. Done. No, it goes on for years and years and years. So 1925 is the first time that a British photographer named Harry Burton, who does the photography, it's the first time he can get this shot. We're in the burial chamber. The tomb of Tutankhamun is 4 pretty small rooms underground. So we're in the burial chamber looking into a room that became known as the treasury. It's all part of the kind of objects that were laid out ritually and organized ritually as part of the burial rites. And so we're looking at this incredible, it's a portable shrine. So it's on 2 long poles so that priests could carry it in procession. So it's a wooden sort of shrine with a statue of a carved wooden jackal laid out on top. And that literally means, it's a box of secrets. Yeah, this is a hieroglyph and a symbol that means the master of secrets. So inside are different magical options, because Egyptian religion is focused on the need for secrecy, for the need for seclusion, and the need for covering things up. So I asked you to go back to this because you can see that around the jackal, the body of this sculpted jackal, there is some cloth, there's textiles wrapped around it. Yeah. And that's part of the ritual. And so and those haven't usually been photographed and often not necessarily preserved. There's actually 2 or 3 layers of textiles around the jackal, which would be applied, right, as the priests are reciting. And they're jackals listen to me, they're textiles that would have a particular significance as well in the rite. Anyway, so I first started looking at photographs from the Tutankhamun excavation to find evidence of the use of textiles for that book that we talked about before, Unwrapping Ancient Egypt. And by that time, I was working in a fantastic department of art history and archaeology and anthropology at the University of East Anglia here in England, in Norwich, in England. And so I was working a lot with colleagues who thought about art and visual culture in a much more challenging way than I'd ever come across when I was trained as an Egyptologist and trained in archaeology. And in particular, there are a lot of fantastic anthropologists who work on photography and who think about photographs not for what they show. I mean, that's part of it, right? I've just tried to explain this photograph and why it's significant, what's significant in my research for what it shows, but for what they do. Yeah, and that's what I like. Yeah, so we're so used to thinking that photographs are they're either like some kind of window on the world, they show things exactly as they were, or there's some kind of piece of art that we're supposed to appreciate. So getting interested, as I was using the photographs for one purpose, I was getting interested in them and thinking, well, gosh, these are actually really kind of weird and wonderful on their own, and had this mythology built up around them about how, when we hear. Somebody interviewed me for a different podcast a couple of months ago, and the nice question he asked was, why is it when we talk about the tomb of Tutankhamun, we always talk about Howard Carter, instead of Tutankhamun, or instead of all the other people involved? So they're part of this mythology of this team of white British men discovering stuff and doing it all, as it completely has written Egyptians out of the story, and also turns archaeology into that Indiana Jones trope that you mentioned at the start there, Mikey, that kind of, masculinity and adventure and gold. So I wanted to look at the photographs, and I thought it would be pretty straightforward because I think they're the most famous photographs from all the history of archaeology. And yet I found that nobody had really looked at them in the way I wanted to look at them, in that kind of way that's more informed by anthropological method, visual anthropology, and photographic history. So that photographs don't show us history, they're not like illustrations, They help make that history. Photographs don't tell us the story of Tutankhamun, they made the story that gets told. And that means there are other stories that haven't been told.
Okay, so that leads perfectly to the question I want to ask, which is, what are some of the questions that you're still perplexed by, that you're still scratching your head about and saying, I don't understand this still?
At the moment, to be honest, I think because I've been doing so much teaching the past couple of years and with the pandemic, I feel kind of like, not so much at the moment that there's something I must know, but that my questions are more about, what do we do now? And this, of course, ties in with the use and abuse of the concept of term decolonization. That decolonization isn't about diversity. It isn't about, oh gosh, we'll make sure there's somebody who isn't white on our panel. It's actually about creating different spaces. So what can I do myself as someone who's had all these privileges and benefited from Western education, from the passport that I hold, from the lingua franca that English is? What can I do now to seed the space? And will my work ever convince, for instance, Egyptologists that there are more things they could and should be doing, in my opinion, to be part of that?
What do you say to let's say like a grad student who comes to you and says, I'm dying to become an Egyptologist. I was so impacted by your books and I want to build on your work. Are you like, pump the brakes? What do you say?
I just say I don't do that anymore. You could go here and here or there, or I think, actually what I have said is, the tools you need, you will not find at the moment, in my opinion, in an Egyptology department or an archaeology department. You need to go elsewhere. So go towards history, art history, anthropology, fields that are more, I think the thing that is, and I understand this having been trained as one, and I'm totally sympathetic to it, but the archaeology and Egyptology tend to still treat, I think they really want to know about the ancient world, which is great, but they kind of want to get at it as if you can do that purely, as if there is some pure data or piece of knowledge out there, some inscription, some coffin, some tomb painting, and you can just get at that. And you don't have to think about the last 200 years. And you don't have to think about questions of racism, of neoliberalism, of military dictatorships, of the colonialism and neocolonialism. You don't have to think about these things. You just get at your data, you write your little article, you do your footnotes, you translate your hieroglyphs, bam, pure knowledge. And I understand the lure of that mindset. And I have a huge respect for that. I was editing for a friend here who is an Egyptologist. I was, checking the language for her for something she's written in English about a legal text from ancient Egypt, and it's fascinating. And I want there to be people who do that. That's important. But I think somehow, and I don't claim to have the answers. I've tried to ask the right questions, and I don't claim to be able to answer them. But we have to get to a point where we can put these things together. That you can't just study the ancient past without also understanding how it exists in the form that it does, and appreciating that there is no purity there, and that all of us, and hopefully this resonates with your mission through afikra, that all of us are implicated in this. It's not about guilt, it's not about beating anybody up, but a co-implication, and what do we do with it?
I always wondered why there, this maybe sound like a super question, but why is there no like similar ologist for neighboring countries and neighboring, locations and empires?
There is for Assyria, Assyriologist is the term, although a lot of people who work in that field today already, I think they're a bit kind of, I would say, ahead in rejecting it on those bases. Also because for them, what counted as ancient Assyria doesn't map onto, literally and figuratively, doesn't map onto a nation state today. Right? Whereas Egyptology has proved more forceful, partly because of its greater cultural exposure.
Interesting.
And because it seems to map onto, and this works for Egypt as well in some ways, right? It seems to map onto a fixed, bounded nation state. It doesn't, of course, but it seems to work.
It's more useful.
Yeah.
I see. I want to talk briefly about ancient Egyptian magic.
Yeah. It's a really cheerful cover, isn't it?
It is a very cheerful book. And I'm curious. I'm just going to read the sort of the back cover, if as it were. Ancient Egyptian Magic: A Hands-On Guide. In the ancient world, if you needed a love charm, wanted to connect with your dead wife, or needed the ability to fly like a bird, the magicians of Egypt were the ones who could make it happen. In ancient Egyptian magic, Christina Riggs explores how the Egyptians thought about magic, who performed it and why, and how also helps readers understand why we've come to think of ancient Egypt in such a mystical way. So this book is, is fun and, curious and interesting. How did you approach writing this book, and how did it fit into your broader rejection of your sort of broader philosophical stance?
Right. Thanks, Matthew. So,
can you tell me, how can I contact my dead wife?
Well, as you need the right kind of like a little magic bowl that you do an inscription in and break and stuff like that. And it'll be fine. Yeah, instructions are all in there.
Chapter 6, love, sex, and babies.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, I started out working in museums. I like communicating complex ideas more widely. And I love writing and trying to do that in different registers. Yeah. So this idea for this book, I have to credit to the wonderful head of classics and archaeology at Thames and Hudson, Ben Hayes. And Ben and I knew each other because I'd written another book for him called, in a series when he was at Reaction Publishers. So it's the one with the black cover. It's about to come out in paperback, actually. Called Egypt, in a series that he formed there called Lost Civilizations. And he got in touch with me about this. And I said, well, Ben, I'll write that book, Lost Civilizations, Egypt, if I can spend the first chapter explaining what the problem is with lost and with civilizations. And he said, go for it. So that was a chance. I kind of tried to distill in that one some of the history of Egyptology into that book. And then when he got back in touch with me, write a book about ancient Egyptian magic, I thought, oh yeah, I can do that. Because again, my work that I had done on wrapping rituals, on textiles, and also as a museum curator, because a lot of the objects in, amulets and things like that are in museums really have to do with magical practices. So I thought, I can do that and do it in a nice, fun, light tone. For me, it makes a nice break from kind of heavier sort of teaching and writing responsibilities. And there's so much more I could have put in. I'm always thinking of people whose work I left out or little things I left out. So I just tried to, for me, that's a chance to use my Egyptological training and knowledge and try to do what I just said I think we still need to do, is how can you combine those? How can you present what we do know and how we know it about ancient Egypt while confronting readers who may not be expecting it with these kinds of questions about race, about the history of Egyptology, about kind of prejudices against women, for instance, in the chapter on sex and babies, or the way in which we know what we know, I think is just as important. And I think I end, for instance, with a little bit about Afrocentrism and ancient Egyptian magic cream. If you buy this nice, it's supposed to be nice, I've never used it actually, cream called Egyptian Magic. So that's why I occasionally do that kind of writing as well.
Cool. Okay, I want to ask you one question before we get to the quick Q&A. And maybe it's the most obvious question. Would the quote unquote ancient Egyptians have described themselves as being Egyptian?
No, they had their own kind of vocabulary, right? They're for Egypt and for a series of people that didn't consider Egyptian, so different kinds of groups, linguistic groups, cultural, ethnic groups, and also how they represented those in art. And then, of course, what we mostly have from Egypt are materials produced by a small elites and by ruling powers, materials produced for or by the king and in his circle. So we're getting one side of the story, and it will have been a much more ethnically and linguistically, I think, varied culture than just what we see represented. And we get hints of that do come through in the material record. But no, they thought of themselves in some other way. And so even this term ancient Egypt already puts us into thinking about something that never existed.
Cool. Okay, let's talk a little bit about, do the quick Q&A, then we have some questions from the audience. So the first question is, what are you reading or watching right now?
I am reading, for pleasure, I'm reading Italian mystery novels, I have to confess.
Nice.
Yeah, because I'm trying to improve my Italian.
You're going to read mystery novels. Italian ones sound like a good choice.
They're pretty good. They have a long, strong tradition of writing mystery novels. So sorry, that's not very intellectual. I was reading, I've left it behind in the UK. I was reading an American scholar named Michael Rothberg. I was reading his book, Implicated Subjects, which deals with, kind of.
My favorite ones are the non-intellectual choices. So I'm glad
that you
led
thank you. Italian mystery novels,
Okay.
Quo Vadis Baby, it's called. Quo Vadis Baby.
Okay, cool. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Oh gosh, I've taken up tango dancing again now that the pandemic's over. So if I could just go follow a tango dancer around in Buenos Aires, that would be great. I might learn something.
That's great. What do people most misunderstand about your work?
One thing I think people have misunderstood, well, one person I know, a couple of people misunderstood about Treasured, for instance, and some of my other work, that we can study the past without understanding the ancient past without understanding the more recent past. Also, that I'm trying to speak for Egyptians. That's absolutely what I'm not doing. I'm trying to be very clear about my own position, and there are political and intellectual and ethical decisions behind that. I have a voice. I want to use it for what I think is the right thing to do, while pointing to the 100 million or so Egyptians that you could be speaking to. When TV producers contact me, I'm like, well, which Egyptians are part of your consulting team and are you speaking to? And I get a lot of blank answers, blank statements.
Okay, last question is, whose work do you admire or are inspired by? It can be in your profession or outside of your profession. Okay,
in my profession, I've been catching up with what I hope will be a future project with the wonderful Dr. Mena Aga, who's a Nubian Egyptian professor of architecture now at Carleton University in Toronto, and with my former colleague, Dr. William Carruthers, who's got a fantastic book coming out. He's based in the UK, called Flooded Pasts, which is called UNESCO, Nubia, and the Recolonization of Archaeology. So it looks at that 1960s campaign. Also, the 100 histories and 100 histories of 100 worlds in one object project, which does podcasts and online resources to challenge. I really recommend people have a look at that.
Awesome. I love it. Okay, let's open up the questions. The first question comes from Sarah, who has asked me to read her question. Beyond the focus on a single country in the title of Egyptologist, the Orientalist and colonialist nature of the field is true for others, such as anthropology. Do you not find that the title/field of study is also problematic in its dehumanizing roots and legacy of white explorers/voyeurs?
Sarah, thank you very much for your question. Yeah, I suppose all sorts of disciplines derive from that ancient Greek format, right, of something plus ology. So anthropos, man, archaeos, old, ancient, biology, right, the life. So yes, it brings that with it. To be honest, I I don't know if any critique within anthropology kind of critiquing it. I suppose because it seems like a word or a term, it seems less problematic maybe than using the name of a country, Egypt, or the name of a place, Assyria. So at some point, yes, we're always getting down to, and decolonization considers this, we're always coming back to that Eurocentric focus, and how do we decenter that, and how do we use other terms and think of other terms and other conceptualizations. I think it's a really important point. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Ada. Our next question comes from Jillian, who I'm asking to unmute. If you want to just unmute yourself.
Okay.
There you are.
Okay, great. Okay, my question is, there's an organization based in Cairo called The Place and the People. And I've become aware of them. They do some really interesting work in involving the Egyptian public in understanding and appreciating ancient Egypt. They did a really great project a while ago where they really focused on the Egyptians who were particularly the workers who were involved in some of the major archaeological projects. And they do a lot of things like giving a lot of talks in Arabic to the public. So, I mean, my question is, do you think that more of this sort of grassroots as well as academic involvement in getting more Egyptians involved in Egyptology, because of course that means there's an immediate connection between past and present, that has the potential to help or change the discipline of Egyptology into something, you know, maybe less colonial? What do you think about that?
Thanks, Jillian. Yes, I know The Place and the People. It's Dr. Fatma Kershik who runs that. And I could also point out the work of another project, a very active community involvement projects and run by Dr. Hiba Abdel Gawad as part of her research, and she's part of the 100 Histories and 100 Worlds team. I'm just going to challenge a bit the wording of your question, Gillian, though, that Egyptians have always been involved in whatever it is that we call Egyptology. There are dozens, hundreds of Egyptologists working in and outside of Egypt, and also Egyptians on every social level. So it isn't just that Egyptians were workers, they were, of course, but Egyptians on every social level, from as far as long back as there was Egyptian archaeology and through the Antiquity service. So that's always been a part. And I think it's more that what these projects are doing are making Western Egyptologists aware of this, or trying to confront them. But we always come back to power differentials and where the balance of power is. So absolutely, it's fantastic that kind of work is going on. It's really important, but it mustn't be seen as some kind of band-aid that allows, or tokenism that allows Western Egyptology, if I can use that rather blunt and not very precise term, to keep doing what it's always done.
Cool. Thanks, Jillian, for your question. Christina, I want to ask you one final question before we go. What do you hope people sort of take away from a talk like this? What do you hope people who engage with your very, very public-facing work take away from your work?
Depends on where they're coming from, right? So I'm always feel that I'm mainly speaking to where I can create space or draw attention to the work of Egyptians and other colleagues in the Middle East and North Africa, or from those origins. That's fantastic. But what I really hope is that people who think that they're interested in ancient Egypt, you know, in the West, broadly speaking, countries, it will open their eyes to other aspects of history and to the importance of understanding more recent history. I suppose one way to put it, I sort of wish ancient Egypt were less popular, or popular in a different way. That's what I hope people will take a bit of an understanding and empathy.
In many ways, I feel like your books are like little mirrors that you're trying to hold up, which is to say that why are you interested in buying this book? please read this book and use it as an opportunity for you to reassess and re-examine why you're interested in it, what political and social forces have led have sort of like led you to the moment where this seed of interest has been cultivated inside of you, and where did that seed come from, who planted it, and where should it have been originally planted?
Mikey, I think you've just described me as subversive. I love it. Thank you.
It is sneakily subversive. Even the ancient Egyptian magic, something about those illustrations allows the subversion to slide on by slowly, but subversive nonetheless.
I could go for that. Sometimes what I've had from Egyptologists, they say I've had people confront me at conferences or on email, yeah, but what do you want us to do? Just tell us what we should do. You know, how do we fix Egyptology? It's not like that. It's a process of self-reflection, a process of learning, and eventually a process of letting go.
Yeah, 100%. Well, Christina, thank you so much for sharing this with us. I really, really, really enjoyed chatting. I feel like we could keep on chatting for hours and
Absolutely.
hours.
Thank you. Me too. But it's been great. And thank you so much, and everybody who's here tonight. Thanks for joining us online. And
yeah, so this is going to go up on the podcast next tomorrow, and we'll go up on YouTube. So please share it with friends. This topic, as we've discussed, is very popular for maybe the wrong reasons, and I hope that this conversation can shed some light on some of the other reasons. Thanks, Christina.
thanks, Mike.